Thanks, Trissa. That was a great introduction and provocative ideas. I enjoyed reading your book, and I think it's got a lot of, this is a plug, of course, for her session next, a lot of ideas that each of us individually can use in our work. But I wanted to start with a structural question. Foundations have a lot of flexibility. We're not selling products, we're not trying to get votes, we're not trying to raise money. So we could design how we work. Why is it that we, generally speaking, confine ourselves to the 3 to 5 year strategic plan and implicitly can't do the future work you're talking about?
I think that foundations have unbelievable flexibility, and yet we create bureaucracies of our own making that make it almost impossible to create change. The joke that I used to tell, and I guess I'm still telling it, when I first started in philanthropy, is my grandma would say, "What is it that you do?" And I'd say, "Well, our foundation gives away money." And she goes, "Well, that doesn't sound very hard." And I'm like, "Let me show you how hard I can make it. Here's a new report, and here's a new complicated way of building structure and bureaucracy within our institutions." I think the larger challenge is who we put in our board seats. So if our board members in their day-to-day lives are living in this place of quarterly returns, if they are living in the news cycle of sort of quick responses to questions, it's really hard to change that mindset to long-term thinking. And I think as foundation leaders, we have to help our board members change the hat that they wear when they come into our boardroom and remind them that perpetuity is about forever. It's not about this quarter, it's not about this year, it's not about our 5-year strategic plan. It is really about our long-term work as organizations. And as CEOs of organizations, we have to start talking that way to our staff and to our board, giving them updates on the very long-term impact that we're having, not just the thing that we can kind of count because it's a widget.
Well, perpetuity is a heck of a long time.
It is.
Right? And I think too hard for all of us to imagine. So if you could just give us an idea, if a foundation, give me advice about how to speak to my board, yep, if I want to propose a 25 or a 50-year strategy. Yep. What does that permit? What's difficult? What do I need to be talking about?
Yeah, 50-year strategies are my favorite because what 50 years gives you is your ego is out of the process, so whose name is going to be tied to success, and you also don't have to do all the work. So I think when you do a short-term 1-year plan, people set really low goals because they look at the pile of work that they're already facing and say, I don't want to think big. But when you talk about 50 years, then suddenly it's about legacy. It's about your children, it's about your grandchildren, it's about what's left behind. For a number of years, I co-chaired an effort in the Twin Cities called the African American Leadership Forum. So there were 1,500 African American leaders. We were working to close racial gaps in things like education, health, and economic development. And the joke was that we couldn't agree on what color the sky was, so how are we gonna come up with a policy agenda? And we used this 50-year model to do that. And in that process, we developed a vision that we were all really excited about, and suddenly a 50-year vision starts to happen in years 2 and 3 because the issue is alignment. The issue is about thinking big enough and developing a vision that people can get excited enough that they're willing to do the hard work of change to get there.
Thanks. And you know, a lot of us, it's challenging to think even beyond 5 years in the future.
For sure.
But many of the foundations here have existed for 30, 40, 50 years. Mm-hmm. And can think back to a time when if we had only made a choice in the past, think where we would be now.
Yeah.
What can foundations learn from looking backward to look forward?
For sure. There's a saying that the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago and the second best time is right now. And I think for many of our institutions, it's very easy to say, oh, we should have worked on climate change a long time ago. We should have worked on education a long time ago. Yes, that is true. And what are you going to do today? What are the long-term issues that your foundation wants to create change in? And how do you start to keep that long-term vision in mind and not go for the easy wins? I mean, as a person that was a program officer in a foundation, I didn't want to bring something to the board that I wasn't positive when the report came next year that it looked fantastic. And I think we've created that cycle within our institutions that it's about short-term wins. We have to start looking at the longer term to find success.
One of the ideas I really liked in your book was the comparison of stabilizers and accelerators.
Yeah.
And there are factors that have been sources of stability: government, family, religion. And I should make a plug for the religious pluralism program that I'm on the panel for next.
Nice.
We'll compete.
Okay, I like it.
In the near future. So there were forces of stability,
Yeah.
but also there are accelerators of change: finance, science, and tech.
Yep.
And now those forces of stability are wobbling,
Yeah.
and those forces of acceleration are getting stronger.
Yeah.
Looking at that, what should foundations do? Should they work on stability? Should they work on acceleration? Should they try to hold everything together?
Yeah. The acceleration's going to happen. Both the business sector and technology are going to ensure that acceleration continues to happen and at a pace that we can't even imagine right now. We've stopped investing in a lot of stabilizers. And so how do we dig down on those institutions that make us feel human and connected with each other? I think the future is going to be a time where many of us look both deeply within and hold more tightly to our networks of support. And foundations can really help build that sense of community, because that's what helps people through rough times. There's a ton of studies about the increase in depression in college-age students and suicidal thoughts. I mean, it's really off the charts. And the beginning of that trend was when smartphones became popular. So you are spending a lot of time sort of with this screen close to your face, ignoring the birds chirping and all of these things that are happening outside of it. And social media is a place where you are constantly comparing yourself to an imaginary version of everybody else. So you're watching everybody else's highlight reels as you are leading your regular life. And it feels like, gosh, what am I doing if everybody else is doing these fantastic things? And so for foundations, thinking about what is our role in building real community? What is our opportunity to bring connections in neighborhoods and in places that we've lost some of that because of people commuting to work? And, Putnam has all of his bowling alone stuff, and, people are not bowling the ways that they've been in the past. I would say there's lots of other ways that we can connect besides bowling, but I think that foundations can be a part of that reconnection process.
Thanks. I see you did not bring a crystal ball.
I did
and you
not.
can't claim not to be certified in crystal ball gazing.
No.
But I'm sure the audience would like to know, after all your thinking on this, what are the things in our future, the trends that are really important for us to recognize and be on top of?
Yeah. I think that there will be a big change in what cities look like. So we're going to have the growth of the megacity. So really people centrally located and very tall buildings and connected in that way. Transportation will look different. Some of you probably know about the tests that are happening with Uber Air that are going to start in 2020 in Los Angeles and in Texas, which is going to be flights that will sort of take you around local communities and over traffic. They're talking about 3-dimensional transportation. Right now the system is 2D. I've been staying in this hotel and I've been talking to my husband about this Uber Air and what it means and that sort of thing. And we were having a meal up and a helicopter flew by the window and I sort of grabbed my chair and I was like, oh my God, it's like right there. And he's like, didn't you just say there's gonna be these like Uber Air things flying all over? Like, it doesn't mean I like it. I'm just saying it's gonna happen. And so as that change happens, rethinking what our cities look like, making sure that your foundations are part of those conversations about how we build cities for the long term and for people that live in them, not just buildings, not just institutions, not just cars. What does it look like for people that are at street level that are moving through? The other change is going to be the rise of robots that we're already seeing that are completely changing our workforce. I think that very soon we're going to have to move to a model of universal basic income where there is a minimum dollar amount for everybody that lives in our society to cover things like housing and food and healthcare, and that we will have to tax the 9 companies that will be making all the money in the world to cover those things. And I know a lot of people have concerns about universal basic income. You know, what are people if they don't work? I will say nobody ever asks very wealthy people that don't work, do you feel like you have purpose? Do you feel like you have meaning? Are you a real human being if you're not, you know, struggling and working 4 jobs? How are you existing in society? I think that universal basic income allows us as a society to move to the place where people's basic needs are taken care of. And then you can take care of children, take care of elderly folks, be engaged in your democracy, still working in those sort of things. But the amount of hours that people will need to work, the Industrial Revolution took us from 80 hours a week to 40 hours a week. I think the technology revolution will move us from 40 to 20 hours a week. I think if all of you are very honest about your social media usage, you are probably already at 20 hours a week of useful work. So we have to start to adjust the ways that we pay people to match what's coming next.
And Trista, you said something very striking about the first curve of philanthropy took 100 years, the second 10 years, and we're 5 years through it.
Yeah.
Tell the people in this room, what do you imagine 5 to 10 years from now in terms of their work, in terms of their daily life, and how can we get prepared for the most generative, productive?
For sure. As I was writing the book, I was interviewing somebody that's an expert in artificial intelligence just to learn more about how it worked. And in the conversation, he said, "Well, I don't know, anything about philanthropy. What is somebody that works at a foundation? What do they do?" I said, "Well, you get these grant applications and you read it and you consider if it's a fit for what your foundation, the sort of change that you want to create in the world. You'll look at outside data to see if there's a case for this sort of thing, and then you'll sort of make a decision about what's the best fit." And he goes, "Oh, I could automate that." And I said, "Oh, please don't. Nobody is asking you to do that." So I think there will be some aspects of our work that will be automated. I think as we're thinking about what is the best case, or analyzing financial statements for nonprofit organizations to look for long-term stability, some of those things will move to automation, and that's fine. I think our role will be more about the relationships and the people part of the work, deeply understanding your grantees, spending time in the communities that you're supporting, connecting people together that are doing disparate pieces of work that you think if they're pulled together, something amazing can happen. That's the really unique work that humans can do. And so as our work changes, understanding what are the things that only people can do and an algorithm can't, and then letting go of some of those repetitive pieces that work within our institution to give our staff more time and space to be able to do that sort of work. So I think for many of our institutions, that change will be about deep relationships and connections. I think for some foundations, 10 years from now, you won't be relevant for the issues and communities that you care about because you wouldn't have jumped to that second curve of philanthropy. And I think that's the challenge for philanthropy right now. Perpetuity means we'll exist forever, but will you be at the tables where decisions are happening about things that are important to you? I've heard from organizations like Black Lives Matter and the Parkland students that they don't see philanthropy as a core partner for their work because our systems are not a good connection for those grassroots movements. And because we don't bend as institutions, we expect the grantees to bend. And for many foundations, they're like, well, we care about those issues. How come they haven't come to us? Because they don't have a professional grant writer to write your 40-page application and to spend all of this time going back and forth with you. So I think our institutions are going to have to be flexible in a way that we haven't in the past.
So we all have messages to take home to our motherships when we go back to work tomorrow. One more question from me, and then we can open it up to the audience. When we were listening to Bryant Marx this morning, it was a very vivid reminder that bias sticks to us, we carry it around with us, and we cultivate it. Yeah. In imagining the future, how do you leave your biases behind or make sure that they are not coloring what you are imagining?
Yeah, I think it's the core work for foundations is to build equity into the DNA of your organizations, not just your grant making, but your role as a human resources organization. How are you hiring and retaining staff? As an economic entity, how are you spending and investing money? And as a community citizen, you have a voice to use. And so what are your processes and policies and systems? I have a process that I lead foundations through called the future of equity. So what does an equitable future look like in your institution? What's different? How does that make you a better grant maker? Because the challenge that I'm seeing in many organizations is that your insides don't match your outsides. So the mission and the things that you talk about do not match what's happening inside organizations. And that's frustrating both for community, but really hard on staff. And I think some of the staff transition, especially transitions of staff members of color, has to do with organizations not matching up. I can't tell you the number of organizations that I've talked to that care about economic justice in their areas, and I say, well, how are you spending money with local businesses? And they go, well, what does that have to do with our grant portfolio? I think we'll move to a time where foundations are 100% mission and program related invested. I don't think it makes any sense that 95% of our dollars are often working against the purposes that we have as institutions. And I think we need to get folks on our finance committees that balance fiduciary responsibility with mission responsibility. And those two things need to be equally important as we make decisions about where our dollars go.
Thanks, Krista. Let's open it up to people. Please. Thanks, Krista. Let's open it up to questions from the audience now.
Hi, really.
You're Emily, right?
Interesting. This is Emily Abbott.
I remember.
It was interesting to hear some of your different thoughts. I'm actually kind of surprised that there's two themes I didn't hear, and curious why not and your thoughts on them. What can you say about the whole issue of water, and what can you say about the issue of climate change? Because they're going to have such huge impacts on the future.
Yep, 1,000,000%. So one of the things that I try really hard to do in this work is to not terrify all of you so that you don't do any of this future work. And climate and water are two things that obviously terrify people, as they should. I think that we are in a race right now for technology to solve the problems that technology has caused when it comes to our environment. And so there are a lot of great folks that are working on amplifying solar power. There's a lot of data that says by 2026 that solar power could meet all of the Earth's needs for energy. Solar is a system that gets cheaper and faster. It's an exponentially growing technology in the ways that other energy uses aren't. When you solve the energy issue, you solve the water crisis. We are a water planet, and most of that water is not accessible. And so if you move to the place where power is essentially free, then suddenly desalinating water is not as expensive of a process. Cleaning wastewater is not as expensive as a process. So I think that there is a ton of investments that need to be made on that. I think that we often talk about the individual part of climate change. So we're not using straws and we're recycling and we're doing all of those things. What we don't talk about is the 100 companies that are responsible for almost all of the climate change. And so as foundations that are currently investing in the stock market, how are we using that voice to push on those companies that we're investing in and hold them to a higher standard that is not just about short-term returns, but about the future of our ability to live on this planet?
Another question?
Yes, thank you. Following up on that question, I was wondering what you might be able to say about using the education system to produce the types of environmental-oriented problem-solving thinkers that the future will need and that the job market also will need.
Yes, 1,000,000%. So if you took Laura Ingalls Wilder from the Little House on the Prairie books, if you put her in a Target, she would lose her mind. There's lights, there's 1,000 different shampoos, it's like too much. But if you put her in a school, she'd know exactly what to do, because we have built our schools around a really outdated model of what's important. Kids have off for the summer so they can harvest. My kids have harvested nothing besides boredom and irritation for their mom all summer. So we have to rethink what those institutions look like. When I talk to folks that are working in the future of education space, they say that our future workforce needs a global mindset, so understanding how to be culturally competent, but in a global way, because that's what our economy is going to look like. They have to have the ability to remix different technologies into something new. So how do you take two existing things and pull it together to something that has new value? And they have to have hustle and flexibility. And so when I look at the most marginalized students in our school system, they are well positioned for all three of those things. And so I think we are entering a time where skill sets that we haven't valued in the past are actually the most important thing moving forward. We often say to my son, if we can just get him through school, he will take over the world. Getting him through school will be the challenge. But after that, really has the creativity and drive to make wonderful things happen, but that is not what's valued in school. And even as a little kid, he would say, why am I memorizing these multiplication tables when I have this cell phone right here that I can type in the numbers and do this? Why do I have to memorize these dates that aren't relevant to the world that I live right now? And so I think for us, some of it is just, oh my goodness, can we get the kids through the system that exists? But how do we adjust that system for what's coming next? That's the really challenge for all of us. And I think when it comes to reframing the education system, the reason why it's so hard is because all of us have been through the education system. And so our view of education has to do with what it looked like when we were sitting in those seats. And we got so much out of it, and so how come kids can't learn in that way right now? We have to let go of some of those biases and instead move to the place where big change can happen.
Please, in the back.
Hi, my name is Donna Bajarski, and I've been furiously writing a lot of the things that you've written down because they're very educational for this sort of critical moment. What continues to worry me about philanthropy are two, and maybe it's not within your, this talk today, but one is the ongoing fact that people with more money are giving less. And this is, a huge ordeal in philanthropy. And moreover, the problem of the individual gift and how we balance the needs of individuals to feel now that they have to follow their money and their passion, which then can change in 5 years, which doesn't necessarily mean it's collaborative, and also which really compromises community-based organizations and umbrella organizations that in fact stay on an issue even when it's not cool. So those are the two things that really worry me.
For sure. I think what we have moving in the future is two complementary and competing trends. So one is the rise of the mega donor. So it's the Zuckerberg, Chan initiative, that sort of thing, where very huge dollars that can influence systems in very different ways. And then we have the rise of the very small donor. And so we have this system now where teeny gifts can roll up together into large change. We've got GoFundMe as the largest funder of healthcare in the United States, which is ridiculous, but yet is the system that is being built. So small donors together are able to influence things in a way that they couldn't before because they're able to connect with these tools. And so I think for community foundations in the audience, how are you investing in those tools that really democratize philanthropy? When it comes to the very large donors, how are you pulling them into these spaces where they're learning from peers? And how are you developing good relationships as foundations with the mega donors to help them connect to what's happening in community issues? I think that tax law changes are going to amplify this disparity because we've lost the value of the charitable tax deduction for everybody except for the mega donor. And it doesn't mean that people will not be philanthropic. What it means is that people will continue to give, but they'll give to their neighbor's GoFundMe, or they'll give to a 501c4 organization that matches their political interests. They won't be giving to traditional 501c3s as they have in the past because the financial incentive isn't there. And so I think that's going to be a huge change for our sector. We're just seeing the beginning of it. I know for myself, when I did my taxes last year, I still had my folder of all my receipts for gifts to nonprofits, and my husband's like, didn't you lobby about that and said that it wasn't going to make a difference? And I was like, oh yeah, no, yeah, it doesn't matter, that's fine. But we're in the habit of doing that. I think in the next couple of years, donors will really realize that there isn't an incentive to give to a traditional 501c3, and they will give to an organization that better matches their interests and needs.
A couple of more questions. Do you have any audience?
Right back there.
Sorry, back here.
Yeah, very excited about the free book. I'll see you in the Silver Lake room. No, I'm not going to stand up. Question, there's a lot of family foundations here. I work at a for-profit company, and I wonder what applies at your speech today, or how you think about translating some of the thinking about change that you've developed. And I can follow up in the Silver Lake room for my free book. But I'm curious if you have any high-level thoughts as to how it relates to corporations.
For sure. All of the trends also are applicable to corporate foundations. And that piece that I said about 100% mission and program-related investment with your endowments, I think it's actually going to be corporate foundations that do that first. So within a corporation, you have a large company with a lot of money that's sitting all over the place. The foundation's assets are a small piece of that pie. And so for a company to say, all of this is now in a mission investment fund is a great feel-good story, and it's not going to impact the assets in a way that it might another institution. So I think for all of these trends, different types of philanthropy are going to be farther ahead or farther back when it comes to it. I think that the participatory grant-making piece actually shows up in a lot of the corporate philanthropy when it comes to employee giving campaigns. And so you have employees that are making decisions about where dollars go, and often are broken up based on what geographic area that they're working on. So they're well connected to that local community and representative of some of those needs. So I think all of these are applicable, but for some, corporate foundations will be way ahead, or some will be slower to implement.
One final question back there.
Hi, Sean Landers, thank you. So I want to go back, maybe go up 30,000 feet and back to the beginning of your remarks, where you made a comment about the pace of change and the accelerating pace of change. I think there's an argument that could be made that we've been in rapidly accelerated change for about 100 years. Yeah. Right? Going back, I mean, the pace of social and technological change is enormous, and a lot of what we're seeing around us that is reactive, right? So what observations might you have for us about becoming resilient, encouraging resiliency, and helping the people we care about and the causes that we care about navigating that resiliency? And while I have the mic, just forgive me, can we have a round of applause for the Las Fotos Project, which is taking pictures today? These are extraordinary young women who I met at Ciclavia, and somebody else must have met them there too, or somewhere else, but they're learning to be photographers, and they're here, and thank you, SCG. I just couldn't resist that, so.
Love it. So I think yes, for the last 100 years, very fast pace of change. I think the issue for all of us is that our brains are built for a time when we lived in communities of 25 to 100 people, and the sort of bigness of our world was how far we could walk. And so as we sort of grew in that model, it was really about the people that you knew personally. And those connections are what we still hold really deeply. There's a lot of studies that say that you can't know more than 50 or 100 people really well. And I know many of you have thousands of Twitter followers or thousands of Facebook friends. It feels like we're very connected to a lot of people, but the deepness of that connection is disappearing. So I think the resiliency for individuals is finding the time and space to breathe and to think. The breakout session is going to be about the future of you. My belief is that if you give people 5 minutes to breathe and think, that they can change the world, and that we just don't have those 5 minutes in most of our days. I think for organizational resiliency, I'm a huge fan of general operating support, And I think that we have to give our nonprofit organizations the flexibility to be able to bend and change to these rapidly changing times. I talked in the beginning about when the economy collapsed when I was at the Headwaters Foundation, and one of the ideas that I heard was if you unrestrict grants that you've already given. So somebody was going to do an after-school program, you unrestrict those funds, the organization can do whatever they need to do to survive through this very challenging time. And I went to the biggest foundations in our state and said, hey, I've heard about these things, this unrestricting, I think we should really consider it. And the CEOs around the table said, well, they already turned in a grant application and they said they were going to do this. We already brought it to our board. We'd have to bring it back if it was something different. I don't think we're going to do that. That sounds like a lot of work. And I was really frustrated because the world was completely different and organizations were closing one after another, and foundations didn't want to be flexible because it was inconvenient for them. And I went back to my foundation and talked to my program director. I was new in the role, and I said, I just had this meeting. It's super frustrating. Nobody's going to unrestrict their grants, but we should. We should step ahead, unrestrict all of the dollars, and sort of show our other foundation partners that this is important. And he goes, so our grants have been unrestricted for our entire history of an organization because we are a social justice funder, and it would be silly for us to think that we know in advance what's going to happen and what our grantees know. And I was like, well, you should keep doing that great work. So I think for us, it's how can foundations be more flexible, and how can we build that resiliency and flexibility in our grantees so that they can continue to do great work.
Trista, thanks for a very thought-provoking look at the future.
Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.